When we started for our drive, the sun was shining brightly on Munich, and the air was full of the joyousness of early summer. Just as we were about to depart, Herr Delbruck, the maître d'hôtel of the Quatre Saisons where I was staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage, and after wishing me a pleasant drive, said to the coachman, "Remember you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there is a shiver in the north wind that says there may be a sudden storm. But I am sure you will not be late." Here he smiled and added, "For you know what night it is." Johann answered with an emphatic, "Ja, mein Herr," and touching his hat, drove off quickly. "Tell me, Johann, what is tonight?" He crossed himself as he answered laconically, "Walpurgisnacht." Then he took out his watch, a great old-fashioned German silver thing as big as a turnip, and looked at it with his eyebrows gathered together and a little impatient shrug of the shoulders. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high, wind-swept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used and which seemed to dip through a little winding valley. I called Johann to drive down that road. He made all sorts of excuses and frequently crossed himself as he spoke. Finally, I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down this road. I shall not ask you to come, but tell me why you do not like to go. That is all I ask." He seemed to throw himself off the box, so quickly did he reach the ground. Then he stretched out his hands appealingly to me and implored me not to go. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him. But each time he pulled himself up, saying, "Walpurgisnacht." The horses became restless and sniffed the air. Looking around in a frightened way, he took them by the bridles and led them on some 20 feet. He pointed to the spot we had left, indicating a cross, and said, first in German, then in English, "Buried him what killed themselves." I remembered the old custom of burying suicides at crossroads. "Ah, I see, a suicide. How interesting." Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. Johann was pale. "It sounds like a wolf, but yet there are no wolves here now." Whilst he was petting the horses and trying to quiet them, dark clouds drifted across the sky. A breath of cold wind seemed to drift over us. Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, "The storm of snow. He comes before long time." "Tell me," I said, "about this place where the road leads." And I pointed down. Again he crossed himself and mumbled a prayer before he answered, "It is unholy. The village." "Then there is a village?" No one lives there hundreds of years." My curiosity was piqued. "But you said there was a village." "There was." "Where is it now?" Whereupon he burst out into a long story in German and English. Long ago, hundreds of years, men had died there and been buried in their graves, but sounds were heard under the clay. And when the graves were opened, men and women were found rosy with life, and their mouths red with blood. And so, in haste to save their lives, aye, and their souls, and here he crossed himself, those who were left fled away to other places, where the living lived, and the dead were dead, and not something. He was evidently afraid to speak the last words. It seemed as if his imagination had got hold of him, and he ended in a perfect paroxysm of fear, white-faced, perspiring, trembling. Finally, in an agony of desperation, he cried, "Walpurgisnacht," and pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All my English blood rose at this. "You are afraid, Johann. You are afraid. Go home. I shall return alone. The walk will do me good. Walpurgisnacht doesn't concern Englishmen." With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horses towards Munich. I leaned on my stick and looked after him. He went slowly along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a man, tall and thin. When he drew near the horses, they began to jump and kick about, then to scream with terror. Johann could not hold them in. They bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight, then looked for the stranger, but I found that he too was gone. I tramped for a couple of hours without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house. So far as the place was concerned, it was desolation itself. A sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me, with now and then, high overhead, a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that great thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south at a great height. The ground I passed over was now much more picturesque, and it was only when the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think of how I should find my way home. For a while I hesitated. I had said I would see the deserted village, so on I went, and presently came on a wide stretch of open country shut in by hills all around. As I looked, there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, and then hurried on to seek shelter of the wood in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, and faster and heavier fell the snow, till the earth before and around me was a glistening white carpet, the further edge of which was lost in misty vagueness. The snow was now falling so thickly and whirling around me in such rapid eddies that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see ahead of me a great mass of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavily coated with snow. I was soon amongst the shelter of them, and there, in comparative silence, I could hear the rush of the wind high overhead. At such moments, the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. As I skirted the edge of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and presently found an opening. Here the cypresses formed an alley leading up to a square mass of some kind of building. Just as I caught sight of this, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I groped my way blindly on. Suddenly, the moonlight broke through the clouds, showing me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square object before me was a great massive tomb of marble, as white as the snow that lay on and all around it. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, with a long, low howl, as of many dogs or wolves. I felt the cold perceptibly grow upon me, till it seemed to grip me by the heart. Impelled by some sort of fascination, I approached the sepulchre and read over the Doric door, in German: Countess Dollingen of Graz, in Styria, sought and found death, 1801. On the top of the tomb, seemingly driven through the solid marble, was a great iron spike or stake. On going to the back, I saw, graven in great Russian letters, "The dead travel fast." I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Johann's advice. Here a thought struck me, which came under almost mysterious circumstances and with a terrible shock. This was Walpurgis night. Walpurgis night, when, according to the belief of millions of people, the devil was abroad, when the graves were opened and the dead came forth and walked. This very place the driver had specially shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay, and this was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold in a shroud of snow, with a wild storm gathering again upon me. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it, and this time the storm bore on its icy wings not snow but great hailstones. The shelter of even a tomb was welcome in that pitiless tempest. and I was about to enter it when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of the heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw, as my eyes turned into the darkness of the tomb, a beautiful woman with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping on a bier. As the thunder broke overhead, I was grasped as by the hand of a giant and hurled out into the storm. Then there came another blinding flash which seemed to strike the iron stake that surmounted the tomb and to pour through to the earth, blasting and crumbling the marble as in a burst of flame. The dead woman rose for a moment of agony while she was lapped in the flame, and her bitter scream of pain was drowned in the thunder crash. The last thing I heard was this mingling of dreadful sound, as again I was seized in the giant grasp and dragged away, while the hailstones beat on me and the air around seemed reverberant with the howling of wolves. The last sight that I remembered was a vague, white, moving mass, as if all the graves around me had sent out the phantoms of their sheeted dead, and that they were closing in on me through the white cloudiness of driving hail. Slowly my senses returned. They seemed to be numbed. There was an icy feeling at the back of my neck and all down my spine, and my ears, like my feet, were dead yet in torment. But there was in my breast a sense of warmth, which was by comparison delicious. It was as a nightmare, a physical nightmare, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. I must have slept or swooned. Then came a sort of loathing, like the first stage of seasickness, and a wild desire to be free of something I knew not what. A vast stillness enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting as of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my throat. Then came a consciousness of the awful truth. Some great animal was lying on me, and now licking my throat. Through my eyelashes I saw above me the two great flaming eyes of a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in the gaping red mouth, its hot breath fierce and acrid upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more. Then, seemingly very far away, I heard a "Hello! Hello!" as of many voices calling in unison. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelped. Then, all at once, from beyond the trees, there came at a trot a troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen, soldiers by their caps and their long military cloaks, raise his carbine and take aim. 2 or 3 of the soldiers jumped down from their horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," he cried. "His heart still beats." Then some brandy was poured down my throat. Lights and shadows were moving among the trees, and I heard men call to one another, uttering frightened exclamations. When the further ones came close to us, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang out hurriedly, No, come away quick, quick. This is no place to stay, and on this of all nights." "What was it?" was the question. The answer came variously and all indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, yet were restrained by some common fear from giving their thoughts. It indeed," gibbered one, whose wits had plainly given out for the moment. "A wolf, and yet not a wolf," another put in shudderingly. "No use trying for him without the sacred bullet," a third remarked. "Serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 1,000 marks." "There was blood on the broken marble," another said after a pause. "The lightning never brought that there. And for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him and keeping his blood warm." The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He is all right. The skin is not pierced. What does it all mean? We should never have found him but for the yelping of the wolf." "What became of it?" asked the man who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party. On his sleeve was the chevron of a petty officer. "It went home," answered another man, who actually shook with terror as he glanced around him fearfully. "There are graves enough there in which it may lie. Come, comrades, let us leave this cursed spot." The officer raised me to a sitting posture as he uttered a word of command. Then several men placed me upon a horse. The next thing I remembered was finding myself standing up, supported by a soldier on each side of me. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north a red streak of sunlight was reflected like a path of blood over the waste of snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what they had seen, except that they found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. "Dog? That was no dog," cut in the man who had exhibited such fear. "I think I know a wolf when I see one." The young officer answered calmly, "I said a dog." "Dog? Look at his throat. Is that the work of a dog, master?" Instinctively I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it I cried out in pain. Again there came the calm voice of the young officer. "A dog, as I said. If aught else were said, we should only be laughed at." I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on into the suburbs of Munich. Here we came across a stray carriage into which I was lifted, and it was driven off to the Quatre Saisons, the young officer accompanying me. When we arrived, Herr Delbruck rushed so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been watching within. Taking me by both hands, he solicitously led me in. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked the officer for saving me. He replied simply that Herr Delbruck had at the first taken steps to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance the maître d'hôtel smiled. "But, Herr Delbruck," I inquired, "how and why was it that the soldiers searched for me?" He shrugged his shoulders. "The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away." "But surely he would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account?" "Oh no," he answered. "But even before the coachman arrived, I had this telegram from the boyar whose guest you are." And he took from his pocket a telegram which he handed to me. "Bistritz. Be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English, and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow, and wolves, and night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. Dracula." As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me. There was something so strange in all this, something so impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being in some way the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed in a way to paralyze me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection. From a distant country had come, in the very nick of time, a message that took me out of the danger of the snow sleep and the jaws of the wolf.
That was Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker, read by Bertie Carvel. The producer was Justine Willett. Well, you'll have to excuse me, I'm afraid. It's time for me to sing that I mention its lullaby as it climbs the wooden steps to Bedfordshire. But it'll be up and about, bright and breezy once again tomorrow, when we'll be joining an amnesiac on a trip to a house he was born in to try and uncover some secrets in shadows of the past. So do join me and old Dimension Face for that. Until then, this is Dan Mersh wishing you a very good night. Good night.
You are leaving the 7th dimension on BBC Radio 4 Extra.
You're safer here than anyplace else.
You're listening to BBC Radio 4 Extra on digital and on BBC Sounds with me, Alan Smith. Now, for something that you only get